blood on the floor. A terrified hospital staff, and one lone nurse staring down the air to the city's deadliest crime syndicate. When she told the Mafia Boss's son to wait his turn, everyone thought she signed her own death warrant. Instead, she triggered a war no one saw coming. Friday nights at Massachusetts General Hospital were a battlefield. But for 31-year-old trauma nurse Madeline Brooks, they were simply just another day at the office. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic, cheap coffee, and the metallic tang of blood. At 11:45 p.m., the double doors of the ambulance bay blew open, bringing in the devastating aftermath of a 3-car pileup on Interstate 93. Madeline was elbow-deep in a critical situation, trying to stabilize a 14-year-old boy with a punctured lung and a shattered collarbone. The monitors were screaming, graphing out the erratic, failing rhythm of the boy's heart. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the senior attending physician, was barking orders as nurses scrambled for chest tubes and IV lines. It was a delicate dance between life and death. Then the main ER lobby doors were kicked open with a violence that made the security guards jump. In walked Dante Romano. Even if you didn't know his face, you knew his type. Clad in a torn Prada shirt, flanked by 2 towering men in leather jackets whose bulges at the hip screamed concealed carry, Dante carried himself like he owned the building. He was 25, reckless, and the only son of Vincent Romano, the undisputed head of the Romano crime family, a man who controlled the city's ports, unions, and half of its politicians. Dante had a gash above his left eyebrow. It was bleeding profusely, as head wounds often do, turning half his face into a crimson mask. It looked terrifying to a civilian, but to any trained medical professional, it was a superficial laceration likely caused by a thrown whiskey glass at one of his family's VIP nightclubs. "I need a doctor right now," Dante bellowed, his voice echoing over the cries of the accident victims in the waiting area. "Get the head of the department, now!" He didn't wait for triage. He didn't take a ticket. Dante shoved past a weeping mother holding a feverish toddler and marched directly into the restricted trauma ward. His 2 bodyguards, men known on the streets as Carmine and Hugo, pushed aside a frantic orderly who tried to block their path. "Hey!" Dante shouted, spotting Dr. Carter and Madeline working frantically on the dying teenager. "Leave that kid and stitch my face, I'm bleeding out here!" Dr. Carter froze. Every nurse and technician in the trauma bay stopped breathing. They all recognized him. The Romano family was infamous. Local news stations practically ran daily segments on their alleged extortion rackets and missing rivals. To deny a Romano was to invite tragedy into your own home. Dr. Carter opened her mouth, her voice trembling. "Mr. Romano, we are dealing with a critical—" "I don't care," Dante snarled, kicking over a sterile tray of surgical instruments. Scalpels and clamps clattered loudly onto the linoleum floor. "Do you know who my father is? If I lose this eye, I'll have this hospital burned to the ground with all of you inside it." Hugo, the larger of the 2 bodyguards, stepped forward, his hand slipping inside his jacket. "You heard the boss. Fix him. Now." The medical staff was paralyzed by sheer terror. The heart monitor attached to the 14-year-old boy began to beep faster, warning of an impending crash. That was when Madeline Brooks had enough. She dropped the blood-soaked gauze into a biohazard bin, turned her back on the monitor, and walked directly up to Dante Romano. She didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She stood 5'6", her scrubs stained with the blood of innocent people, and looked the Mafia prince dead in his uninjured eye. "You are not dying," Madeline said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy calm that cut through the chaos of the room. You have a 2-inch laceration that requires maybe 6 stitches and a tetanus shot. That boy on the table is drowning in his own blood." Dante stared at her, genuinely shocked. For a moment, the ER was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Are you stupid?" Dante whispered dangerously, leaning in so close Madeline could smell the expensive cologne and stale whiskey on his breath. "I will end your life. I will end your family." "You can try tomorrow," Madeline snapped back, her brown eyes blazing with an uncompromising fury. "But tonight, you take a seat in the waiting room like everybody else, or I will have security drag you out by your designer collar. You do not interrupt my trauma bay. Get out." Hugo lunged forward to grab Madeline, but Dante threw a hand up, stopping his enforcer. Dante wiped the blood from his eye, smearing it across his cheek, and let out a cold, dark laugh. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Dante asked. "Madeline Brooks, shift supervisor," she replied, not breaking eye contact. "Madeline Brooks," Dante repeated, committing it to memory. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic minimum-wage life. You're dead. You hear me? You're a dead woman walking." Without another word, Dante turned on his heel and stormed out of the trauma bay, his bodyguards trailing right behind him. As soon as the doors swung shut, the collective breath of the ER was released. Dr. Carter leaned against the wall, her face pale as a sheet. "Madeline, what did you just do?" "My job," Madeline said, instantly pivoting back to the dying boy on the table. "Hand me the chest tube, doctor. We have 3 minutes before his lung fully collapses." By 3 a.m., the adrenaline had worn off, leaving a cold, heavy dread in the pit of Madeline's stomach. The 14-year-old boy had survived surgery and was resting securely in the ICU. The ER had finally quieted down, the drunken brawlers and accident victims processed and treated. But a suffocating tension hung over the hospital staff. Dante Romano had eventually been stitched up by a terrified first-year intern in a supply closet, simply to get him out of the building. But before he left, Dante had made a single phone call. Madeline was standing in the break room, washing her hands in the small sink. The warm water ran pink with the dried blood of strangers. The door clicked shut behind her. She looked up to see head nurse Brenda Wallace, a woman who had worked at Mass Gen for 30 years. Brenda looked terrified. "Maddie, you need to leave," Brenda whispered, looking over her shoulder as if the walls were listening. "My shift doesn't end until 6, Brenda," Madeline replied, drying her hands on a paper towel. "I don't care about your shift. Do you understand what you did?" Brenda's voice cracked. "That was Vincent Romano's boy. You humiliated him in front of his men. The police won't protect you. The hospital administration is already drafting your termination papers to distance themselves from you. You need to pack your bags, go to the airport, and get out of Massachusetts." "I am not running," Madeline said, though her hands were shaking slightly. "I prioritized a critical patient. It's triage protocol. If the hospital fires me, I'll sue. If the Romanos want to kill me for doing my job, let them try. I'm not a coward." "It's not about being a coward. It's about staying alive," Brenda pleaded. Before Madeline could respond, the hospital intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the usual automated chime. It was the frantic, breathless voice of the front desk receptionist. "Code Black. ER lobby. Code Black. Code Black." A localized threat. Madeline burst out of the break room and sprinted toward the main reception area, Dr. Carter and Brenda hot on her heels. As they rounded the corner into the expansive glass-fronted lobby, Madeline stopped dead in her tracks. 4 matte black Cadillac Escalades had driven directly up onto the pedestrian sidewalk, blocking the ambulance bays. The automatic glass doors were propped open. A dozen men in tailored dark suits had seamlessly secured the perimeter of the lobby. They didn't draw weapons, but they didn't need to. The sheer, coordinated menace of their presence sent the remaining waiting room patients fleeing into the hallways. In the center of the lobby stood Vincent Romano. He was a man who commanded gravity. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back immaculately, and a charcoal wool overcoat draped over his shoulders. His eyes were the color of wet slate, lifeless, calculating, and utterly terrifying. Standing just behind his right shoulder was Dante, a thick white bandage taped over his eyebrow. Dante was smirking, a vile, triumphant grin that made Madeline's blood boil. Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief of medicine, was already in the lobby, practically shaking out of his loafers as he tried to speak to the mob boss. "Mr. Romano," Dr. Harrison stammered, "we deeply apologize for the unfortunate misunderstanding earlier tonight. The nurse in question is being terminated immediately, and we are willing to offer—" Vincent raised a single gloved hand. Dr. Harrison instantly snapped his mouth shut. "I didn't come here to speak to a bureaucrat." Vincent's voice was a low rumble, devoid of any discernible emotion, yet it echoed perfectly in the silent lobby. "I came here for the nurse." Dante pointed a finger across the room. "That's her, Pop. That's the one who disrespected us." Every eye in the lobby turned to Madeline Brooks. Her colleagues stepped away from her, instinctively distancing themselves from the blast zone. She was completely, utterly alone. Madeline swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, but her pride refused to let her cower. She stepped forward, out of the hallway, and into the center of the lobby, stopping 10 feet away from the most dangerous man on the East Coast. "I am Madeline Brooks," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "I'm the nurse who treated your son." Vincent Romano stared at her. He looked her up and down, taking in her blood-stained scrubs, her exhausted posture, and the defiant fire in her eyes. The silence stretched on for agonizing seconds. It felt like an execution was about to happen, right there, under the fluorescent hospital lights. "My son tells me you refused to treat him," Vincent said slowly. "He tells me you threatened him with security. He tells me you humiliated the Romano name in front of this entire hospital." "Your son," Madeline replied, refusing to break his gaze, "demanded a trauma team for a minor scratch while a 14-year-old boy was dying from a crushed chest cavity. I did not humiliate your name, Mr. Romano. Your son did that all by himself by acting like a spoiled child." Gasps echoed from the nurse's station. Dr. Harrison looked like he was about to faint. Dante's face twisted in rage. "You stupid!" Dante lunged forward, raising his fist to strike Madeline right there in the lobby. Crack! The sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed like a gunshot. Madeline squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. But the blow never came. She opened her eyes. Dante Romano was sprawled on the linoleum floor, holding his jaw, staring up in absolute shock. Vincent Romano stood over him, having just backhanded his own son with enough force to floor a grown man. Vincent didn't even look at Dante. His cold, slate-grey eyes remained entirely fixed on Madeline. "Get up, Dante," Vincent ordered, his voice laced with disgust, "and go wait in the car." "Pop, what are you doing?" Dante whined, tasting blood from his split lip. "She disrespected us." "She did her job!" Vincent roared, the sudden explosion of anger making even his own heavily armed enforcers flinch. "You come into a hospital, crying about a glass cut, interrupting doctors trying to save a child's life. You are an embarrassment to this family. Get out of my sight before I do worse than slap you." Dante, humiliated and trembling with rage, scrambled to his feet and stormed out the sliding glass doors, disappearing into one of the idling escalades. The hospital lobby was dead silent. Madeline stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the impossible scene that had just played out. Vincent Romano took a deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of his coat, instantly returning to his terrifyingly calm demeanor. He took 2 steps closer to Madeline. "Miss Brooks," Vincent said, his tone entirely shifted. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an assessment. "Do you know how many people have told my son no in his entire life?" Madeline shook her head slowly. "None," Vincent said softly. "Until tonight. You looked at a gun pointed at your career, maybe even your life, and you chose the dying boy on the table. You couldn't be bought, and you couldn't be bullied." Vincent reached into the inner pocket of his suit. The hospital security guards tensed, but he merely withdrew a sleek, black business card and held it out to her. "I don't need a sycophant, Miss Brooks," Vincent said, leaning in slightly. "My personal physician passed away last week. I am an old man in a dangerous line of work, and I have a private, state-of-the-art medical facility at my estate. I need someone who won't shake when the blood starts pouring. Someone who tells the truth, no matter who is standing in front of them." Madeline looked at the black card in his hand, then back up to his eyes. "You want to hire me? I am offering you 10 times whatever this hospital pays you, complete immunity from anyone in this city, and my personal protection," Vincent replied. "But make no mistake, I am not asking. I am collecting you. Because a war is coming to Boston, Madeline, and you are the only nurse I trust to keep me alive when it starts." The transition from the sterile, chaotic environment of Massachusetts General Hospital to the sprawling, fortified Romano estate in Weston was incredibly jarring. Madeline Brooks found herself standing in a subterranean medical suite that rivaled the finest surgical theaters in the entire country. Stainless steel tables, state-of-the-art trauma bays, an on-site blood bank, and a fully stocked pharmacy lined the meticulously clean walls. It was a gilded cage, but operating entirely off the grid. She was officially the highest-paid nurse in New England, but the currency was loyalty, and the penalty for failure was death. Vincent Romano had kept his word. Madeline was treated with absolute deference by the heavily armed men patrolling the sprawling grounds. She was given a luxurious suite in the East Wing and a dedicated bodyguard, a quiet, intensely lethal man named Lorenzo. Lorenzo was Vincent's underboss, an orphan raised within the syndicate who possessed eyes like shards of blue ice and a demeanor so calm it was genuinely unnerving. Unlike Dante's chaotic, fragile ego, Lorenzo carried the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to raise his voice to command a crowded room. From the moment Madeline arrived, Lorenzo was a shadow by her side, watching her with a complex mix of suspicion and undeniable, slow-burning intrigue. For the first 3 weeks, the job was surprisingly peaceful. Madeline managed Vincent's hypertension, monitored his cardiac health, and treated minor injuries sustained by the estate's guards during routine business disputes. The underlying tension, however, was incredibly suffocating. Dante roamed the estate like a caged, rabid animal. His pride had been utterly shattered in the hospital lobby, and his father's open preference for Lorenzo's counsel only fueled his toxic resentment. Every time Dante looked at Madeline, his eyes promised terrible violence. He blamed her for his public humiliation, a festering, rotting wound that absolutely no stitches could ever hope to heal. The promised war finally erupted on a storm-battered Tuesday night in late November. Madeleine was standing in the clinic, quietly taking inventory of the fentanyl lockbox, when the estate's klaxons suddenly began to scream. The deafening alarms cut harshly through the sound of the torrential rain lashing violently against the reinforced windows. Before she could even process the warning, the heavy steel door to the clinic was thrown forcefully open. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, his tailored black suit completely soaked and clinging tightly to his broad, muscular shoulders. He was gripping a suppressed submachine gun in his right hand. Dark red blood dripped steadily from a shallow graze on his rugged cheek. "Lock the perimeter doors, Madeline," Lorenzo ordered, his deep voice remarkably steady, despite the chaotic madness echoing loudly from the floors above. The rapid staccato pop of automatic gunfire loudly rattled the ceiling fixtures. The Moretti family completely bypassed the outer gates. They had insider knowledge of our security grid. "We are being rapidly overrun." "Where is Vincent?" Madeline asked urgently, her extensive medical training instantly overriding her rising terror. She quickly reached for a sterile trauma kit, frantically ripping open plastic packages of gauze and swiftly readying heavy-duty tourniquets. "They hit his study first," Lorenzo replied, his square jaw tightening in barely suppressed fury. "They knew exactly where he would be sitting. I have an elite team extracting him right now, but it is incredibly bad. You need to prep the surgical theater immediately." Madeline did not hesitate for a single second. She scrubbed in rapidly, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribcage. She thoroughly prepped the complex anesthesia machine, carefully checked the vital oxygen lines, and meticulously laid out the gleaming scalpel tray. The explosive gunfire grew steadily louder, echoing ominously down the grand marble staircases of the luxury mansion. Suddenly, 3 blood-soaked enforcers dragged Vincent Romano violently into the bright clinic. The imposing, legendary Mafia Don was frighteningly pale, gasping weakly for air, desperately clutching his lower abdomen. Dark, pulsating arterial blood soaked heavily through his expensive white dress shirt, spilling rapidly onto the pristine white floor tiles. "Get him onto the table, right now!" Madeline shouted authoritatively, pointing sharply to the primary trauma bay in the center of the room. The desperate men hoisted Vincent heavily onto the cold steel table. Lorenzo immediately took up a defensive, tactical position by the heavy blast door, securely locking the thick iron deadbolts. Madeline used trauma shears to quickly cut away Vincent's ruined, bloody shirt. Her stomach dropped violently. He had taken 2 high-caliber rifle rounds directly to the lower abdomen. One heavy bullet had completely shattered a rib, and the other had penetrated incredibly deep, likely severing the descending aorta. It was a catastrophic, instantly fatal injury in 99% of standard medical cases. "I need a qualified surgeon," Madeline said frantically, her gloved hands flying rapidly over the horrific wounds, applying immense, bruising pressure. "Lorenzo, I am just a trauma nurse. This requires a complex vascular bypass. I absolutely cannot do this alone. The nearest syndicate doctor is 40 minutes away, and the local roads are completely blocked by Moretti hitmen," Lorenzo stated firmly, his piercing blue eyes locking intensely onto hers. "You are all he has left, Madeline. You either operate right now, or the entire Romano family falls tonight." Before she could bravely reach for a surgical scalpel, the blast door's intercom abruptly buzzed. A harsh, chillingly familiar voice crackled loudly through the small speaker. "Open the door, Lorenzo. It is finally over." Dante's voice was completely dripping with malicious, triumphant glee. "Let the old man bleed out." Madeline completely froze, a chilling, horrifying realization rapidly washing over her. Dante had orchestrated this entire bloodbath. The heavy silence inside the underground clinic was nearly absolute, broken only by the ragged, wet, struggling breathing of Vincent Romano and the frantic, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor. Outside the incredibly thick, reinforced steel door, Dante proudly stood with a heavily armed squad of ruthless traitors. He had cowardly sold his own father to the rival Moretti family, cruelly trading blood for an early, unearned inheritance and the absolute unchecked power he so desperately, pathetically craved. "Open the door, Lorenzo!" Dante shouted angrily, violently banging the heavy butt of a tactical rifle against the steel. "The Morettis own the entire estate. My father's pathetic loyalists are all dead. If you simply open the door, I will let you walk away freely. You can safely leave the city. Just step aside gracefully and let that arrogant, worthless nurse fail." Lorenzo did not move a single inch toward the locked door. Instead, he calmly checked the loaded magazine of his weapon, his handsome expression rapidly hardening into a terrifying mask of pure, lethal, unwavering resolve. He looked gently at Madeline, his intense gaze miraculously softening for a tiny fraction of a second, a powerful, unspoken promise passing silently between them. "Do your job, Madeline," Lorenzo said softly, yet firmly. "I will do mine. He is absolutely not coming through that door." Madeline took a sharp, desperate, steadying breath. She willfully tuned out the angry shouting. She willfully tuned out the violent gunfire that rapidly resumed echoing endlessly through the marble corridors. She focused entirely on the dying, bleeding man on the cold table. She quickly injected a heavy, precise dose of propofol, expertly intubated Vincent with practiced, flawless efficiency, and bravely grabbed a sharp surgical scalpel. Her delicate hands, which had trembled violently in the break room of Massachusetts General Hospital, were now entirely, miraculously still. She bravely made the very first critical incision, carefully opening the damaged abdominal cavity. The internal, hidden bleeding was truly massive. Thick crimson blood pooled incredibly rapidly, completely obscuring her narrow field of vision. She desperately grabbed a plastic suction tube, frantically clearing the bloody area until she finally spotted the severely severed artery. It was a jagged, horrifyingly complex tear. Relying purely, desperately on the thick emergency combat medicine manuals she had obsessively read during her quiet night shifts, Madeline successfully clamped the spurting artery, her slender fingers incredibly slick and painfully cramping from the immense, sustained physical effort. A loud, explosive, terrifying crash violently shook the clinic walls. Dante had ruthlessly brought military explosives to forcefully breach the heavy blast door. Grey dust rained heavily down from the ceiling, threateningly contaminating the delicate, sterile field. "I desperately need more time," Madeline screamed loudly over the deafening, ringing noise, desperately trying to properly suture the ruined vascular tissue. "You firmly have all the precious time in the entire world," Lorenzo replied smoothly. He quickly moved to the secondary, hidden armory locker built seamlessly into the clinic wall, smoothly retrieving 2 heavy, deadly fragmentation grenades and a brutal tactical shotgun. The heavy blast door buckled violently inward with a sickening metallic groan as a powerful second explosive charge successfully detonated. The thick locking mechanisms completely shattered. The heavy steel door swung violently open, instantly revealing Dante, standing arrogantly in the thick grey smoke, securely flanked by 4 heavily armed, ruthless mercenaries. "I specifically told you, Lorenzo," Dante sneered cruelly, aggressively raising his black rifle. "It is finally my time now." Lorenzo didn't waste a single breath on a useless reply. He ruthlessly pulled the metal pins on both deadly grenades and forcefully hurled them directly into the narrow, crowded corridor outside the clinic, instantly diving gracefully behind a heavily reinforced steel medical supply cabinet. The twin deafening detonations were absolutely catastrophic, sending a massive, violent shockwave ripping through the small room that brutally knocked Madeline directly to her bruised knees. Lethal shrapnel tore viciously through the narrow corridor, instantly and permanently neutralizing the heavily armed mercenaries. Dante, shielded only slightly by the thick metal doorway, was thrown violently backward, his heavy weapon clattering uselessly across the bloody floor. Before the thick smoke could even begin to slowly clear, Lorenzo vaulted swiftly over the heavy cabinet, smoothly racking the tactical shotgun with a truly terrifying, loud metallic clack. He stepped confidently out into the totally ruined, bloody hallway. Madeline clearly heard Dante screaming loudly, pathetically begging for mercy, desperately pleading with the quiet man he had once falsely called a loyal brother. A single booming shotgun blast instantly silenced him forever. Madeline dragged herself desperately back up to the cold operating table. Vincent's critical vitals were rapidly crashing. The sensitive monitor alarmed incredibly violently. She frantically grabbed the heavy defibrillator paddles, swiftly charged them to 200 powerful joules, and forcefully pressed them firmly against his bare, bloody chest. "Clear!" she shouted loudly, powerfully shocking the dying Mafia Boss. His heavy body arched violently off the flat table. A terrifying flatline hummed loudly through the quiet room. "No, you absolutely don't!" Madeline growled angrily, stubbornly charging the heavy paddles once again. "You forcefully brought me into this terrible hell. You absolutely do not get to cowardly die on my table. Clear!" The powerful second shock delivered seamlessly. The sensitive monitor hesitated greatly. A very long, truly agonizing pause, stretching out into an endless eternity, before a single, steady, beautiful beep echoed loudly in the quiet room. Then a second one, and another. The chaotic rhythm completely stabilized. The massive bleeding was totally contained. She had miraculously achieved the totally impossible. She had successfully pulled the terrifying devil himself safely back from the fiery brink of hell. Lorenzo walked slowly back into the quiet clinic, his expensive suit totally ruined, his handsome face completely covered in dark soot and red blood. He looked quietly at the steady monitor, then safely down at the deeply unconscious, incredibly stabilized form of Vincent Romano. Finally, his striking eyes rested gently on Madeline. She was completely covered in dark blood, utterly exhausted, desperately clutching the sharp edge of the operating table just to forcefully keep herself standing upright. Lorenzo walked slowly, purposefully over to her, completely bypassing the horrific carnage. He gently, warmly reached out, his incredibly large, softly calloused hand wiping a fresh smear of dark blood affectionately from her pale cheek. The freezing, icy distance in his striking eyes had completely, beautifully melted away, wholly replaced by a truly profound, endlessly burning, passionate devotion. "You miraculously saved him," Lorenzo whispered deeply, stepping impossibly, warmly close, his broad chest lightly brushing delicately against hers. "I simply did my job," Madeline replied quietly, her soft voice trembling very slightly as she looked bravely up into his incredibly intense, gorgeous gaze. "No," Lorenzo corrected very softly, his gentle thumb slowly, lovingly tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "You wonderfully saved this entire family. You beautifully saved me. And from this very night forward, Madeline Brooks, there is absolutely nothing in this entire dark world I will not endlessly do to fiercely protect you." The bloody Mafia war had truly just begun. But as Lorenzo's strong, warm hand rested gently on her waist, Madeline clearly realized she was absolutely no longer a helpless captive trapped in a dangerous, gilded cage. She was proudly the powerful new queen on a dangerous, blood-stained chessboard, and the most dangerously lethal man in the entire criminal city belonged totally and completely entirely to her alone. Did Madeline make the right choice standing up to the Mafia, or is she in too deep? If you loved this intense medical romance drama, smash that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories, unexpected plot twists, and dangerous romances every single week. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Madeline's shoes. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.